The rain began before dawn, drumming against the black stone towers of House Vesperine like the warning beat of war drums. Most men would have called it an omen. Duke Cadric Vesperine called it Tuesday. He stood alone in the war room while the storm clawed at the windows, studying territorial maps that had been redrawn in blood more times than ink. Blackmere Keep rose around him like a monument to everything survival cost when you refused to die quietly. The fortress had stood for 3 centuries. Cadric had ruled it for 15 years. In that time, he had learned that power was not inherited through bloodlines or bestowed by kings. Power was taken from the hands of men too weak to hold it, and kept through the kind of ruthless clarity that made mercy look like suicide. The nobles called him cold. They were wrong. Cold implied the absence of feeling. What Cadric possessed was something far more dangerous: the absolute certainty that sentiment was a luxury purchased with other people's lives, and he had stopped making payments years ago. The door opened without announcement. Lord Garrett Thorne entered with the practiced caution of a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts and understood that the 4th one was always coming. He was Cadric's only friend, which was another way of saying he was the only person in the kingdom stupid enough to walk into rooms where the Duke kept his silence like a loaded weapon. Garrett stopped beside the map table and studied the red markers indicating contested territories along the northern border. "What are we looking at?" "A mistake," Cadric said without looking up. 3 minor houses have been moving grain stores to fortified positions. They think I haven't noticed." Garrett frowned. "You think they're planning something?" "I think they're planning to die slowly." Cadric traced a line across the map with one gloved finger. "The question is whether I kill them before or after they make their move official." There was no humor in his voice. There never was. Cadric spoke about violence the way other men discussed crop rotations, with the detached efficiency of someone who had long ago accepted that brutality was just another form of agricultural planning. You planted fear. You harvested obedience. Sometimes the soil required blood to stay fertile. Garrett shifted his weight. "The king wants you at the capital for the spring conclave. All the great houses are expected to attend. Then the great houses can enjoy my absence. Cadric, you can't ignore a royal summons. Watch me." The Duke finally looked up. His eyes were the color of slate before a storm, gray and unforgiving and completely empty of anything resembling doubt. Cadric had been born into nobility but shaped by something far older than aristocratic tradition. His father had been a brilliant politician and a worse father, the kind of man who believed that love was weakness, and teaching that lesson required breaking bones until the point was internalized. By the time Cadric was 12, he had learned that survival meant becoming the kind of person who could look at cruelty and feel nothing, who could watch his own father bleed out from a hunting accident and understand that grief was just another liability he couldn't afford. He had not cried then. He had not cried since. Garrett studied him for a long moment, reading the silence the way old friends learn to read the things left unsaid. "You're going to start a war if you don't show up." "No." Cadric returned his attention to the maps. "I'm going to prevent one. Every minute I spend playing diplomat in the capital is a minute these northern lords think I'm distracted. Let them plan. Let them conspire. Let them believe I'm too arrogant to notice their pathetic little rebellion brewing. And when they move, I burn their estates to ash and salt the earth so thoroughly that historians will forget their houses ever existed." The statement carried no emphasis, no dramatic pause. Cadric delivered threats the way other men discussed weather patterns, with the casual certainty of someone describing facts rather than intentions. That was what truly terrified the nobility. Not his capacity for violence, but his complete lack of hesitation when deploying it. Garrett sighed. "The king won't like this. The king is welcome to come here and express his disappointment personally." Cadric's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles were supposed to make people reconsider their life choices. I'll even let him finish a complete sentence before I remind him which one of us actually controls the military routes into the northern territories. "You really are a bastard." "Yes, but I'm an effective bastard." "There's a difference." Thunder rolled across the mountains. The war room trembled slightly, the way stone always did when nature decided to demonstrate that even fortresses were temporary. Cadric felt the vibration through his boots, and thought about how everything was always threatening to fall apart. Buildings, kingdoms, men. The only difference was speed. Some things collapsed quickly in fire and blood. Others crumbled slowly across decades while everyone pretended not to notice the cracks spreading through the foundation. House Vesperine had been crumbling when Cadric inherited it. Now it dominated half the kingdom. That transformation had not been accomplished through diplomacy. Garrett moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, the nobles are starting to call you the Wolf of Blackmere. They mean it as an insult. Cadric didn't look up from the maps. Wolves survive. Sheep get slaughtered. They can call me whatever helps them sleep at night. After Garrett left, the Duke remained alone in the war room while dawn broke gray and violent across the cliffs. He studied the territorial markers with the focused intensity of a man who understood that kingdoms were just organized violence wrapped in ceremony, and the only thing separating civilization from chaos was the willingness of certain men to do what others called monstrous. His father had taught him that lesson before teaching him anything else. The memory arrived unwanted, the way trauma always did. Cadric, at 9 years old, watching his father interrogate a servant accused of theft. The man had been guilty. That hadn't been the lesson. The lesson had been in how his father had prolonged the punishment, turning justice into performance art, making sure young Cadric understood that power meant the ability to inflict suffering without consequence. "Your weakness is that you feel too much," his father had said afterward, gripping Cadric's shoulder hard enough to bruise. "A ruler who cares is a ruler who can be controlled." "Stop feeling, boy. Start thinking." Cadric had stopped feeling. He had started thinking. And when his father died 3 years later, trampled by a horse that had been spooked by circumstances Cadric never quite explained, he had assumed control of House Vesperine with the cold efficiency of someone who had been waiting patiently for the previous management to exit. The nobles had expected a child playing at lordship. They had discovered something else entirely. The storm intensified throughout the morning, battering the keep with rain that fell like nails against the ancient stone. Cadric moved through the fortress with the silent authority of someone who knew every corridor, every servant, every potential threat. He stopped briefly in the armory to inspect new sword shipments, spoke with the quartermaster about food stores, reviewed trade reports that indicated grain prices were rising in the eastern provinces. A proper duke would have delegated these tasks. Cadric delegated nothing. Control was not something you shared. It was something you maintained through obsessive attention to detail and the absolute unwillingness to trust anyone with anything that mattered. Every servant in Blackmere understood that the Duke saw everything, knew everything, and forgot nothing. It made them efficient. It made them loyal. It made them terrified, all of which was exactly the point. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained bruised and threatening. Cadric stood in the eastern gallery overlooking the cliffs, watching merchant caravans navigate the switchback roads far below. Trade routes were the arteries of power. Control the roads, you controlled the flow of goods. Control the flow of goods, you controlled the economy. Control the economy, you controlled everything else through the slow strangulation of resources. Simple mathematics, brutal application. He heard footsteps approaching from behind. Soft, measured, female. "Your Grace." Cadric didn't turn. "Lady Meredith. I wasn't aware you had business in the Eastern Wing." Lady Meredith Ashford was the daughter of a powerful border lord and one of 3 noble women currently fostered at Blackmere under the polite fiction of cultural exchange. In reality, they were hostages dressed in silk, political leverage disguised as honored guests. She was intelligent enough to understand her position and smart enough not to mention it. "I came to inform you that Lord Ashford has sent word." Meredith moved to stand beside him at the window, careful to maintain proper distance. "He asks after my well-being." "How considerate." Cadric's tone suggested he found it anything but. "You may write him and confirm that you remain remarkably alive. Shall I also mention how much I'm learning about governance? You may mention whatever you believe will keep your father obedient." Meredith stiffened slightly. That was the thing about noble hostages. They always wanted to pretend they were there by choice, that their captivity was somehow dignified by ceremony and protocol. Cadric never bothered with the pretense. He preferred everyone understand exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of leverage. "My father is not your enemy," she said carefully. "No." Cadric finally turned to look at her. He's my insurance policy. There's a difference. She met his gaze without flinching, which he respected. Most people couldn't hold eye contact with him for more than 3 seconds. Something about his stare made them feel like they were being assessed for structural weaknesses, which was accurate because that was exactly what he was doing. "Do you enjoy this?" Meredith asked quietly. "Making people afraid?" "I enjoy surviving. Fear is just the most efficient tool available. You could rule through respect." Kadrick smiled, and Meredith took an involuntary step backward. There it was, the unconscious retreat, the lizard brain recognition that something dangerous was standing too close. He had seen that reaction 1,000 times. It never got old. Respect is what frightened people call fear when they want to feel better about their obedience. Kedrick moved past her toward the corridor. "You're dismissed, Lady Meredith. Give your father my regards and remind him that his cooperation ensures your continued health and happiness." He left her standing in the gallery and descended to the lower levels where the real work of maintaining power happened. The dungeons beneath Blackmere were not for show. They were functional spaces where traitors learned that betrayal carried consequences that extended well beyond death. Kadrick visited them weekly, not because he enjoyed torture, but because he understood that fear required maintenance. A reputation for brutality only worked if people believed you were willing to follow through. He was always willing to follow through. The head jailer met him at the entrance with a bow. "Your Grace, the prisoner is ready." The prisoner was Lord Harwick, a minor noble who had been caught embezzling tax revenue through falsified trade records. Stupid crime. Predictable punishment. Kaedric entered the cell where Harwick hung in chains, bloody and broken and still clinging to the desperate hope that this was all somehow a misunderstanding. "Please," Harwick whispered. "My family." "We'll be fine," Kadrick interrupted calmly. "I've already arranged for your lands to be absorbed into the duchy. Your wife and children will be relocated to a comfortable estate in the south. They'll live well. They'll live quietly. They'll live with the knowledge that their patriarch died because he forgot that stealing from me is suicide with extra steps. I didn't think—" "No, you didn't. That's the problem." Kadrick studied him with the detached curiosity of someone examining a failed experiment. This was the part where most lords made speeches about justice and consequence, where they pontificated about duty and honor and all the other words aristocrats use to justify cruelty. Kadrick had stopped bothering with speeches years ago. Violence didn't require explanation. It required execution. He nodded to the jailer. "Make it quick." He left before Harwick started screaming. That evening, Kadrick dined alone in the great hall at a table built for 30 people. The servants moved through shadows, refilling wine and clearing plates with the silent efficiency of those who understood that the Duke preferred solitude to company. The meal was excessive because everything in Blackmere was excessive. Power demanded display. Intimidation required theater. Garrett appeared halfway through the second course, which meant something had gone wrong. "We have a situation," Garrett said without preamble. "The king has sent a messenger. He's demanding your presence at the capital within the week. Or what? Or he'll consider your absence an act of defiance." Kedrick cut into roasted venison with surgical precision. "Good. Let him consider it exactly that. Kedrick, this is serious. You're backing him into a corner." "He's backing himself into a corner by pretending he has authority over how I manage my own territories." Kadrick took a bite, chewed methodically, swallowed. "The king is welcome to send his demands. I'm welcome to ignore them. That's how sovereignty works when you control the roads, the grain stores, and most of the kingdom's military infrastructure. You're going to force a confrontation. No, I'm going to force a decision. Either the king accepts that House Vesperine operates independently, or he tries to do something about it and learns why every noble house between here and the capital pays me tribute instead of him." Garrett sat down across from him without invitation. "You know what your problem is? Enlighten me. You're so obsessed with maintaining control that you can't see when you're about to lose it entirely. You're making enemies faster than you can kill them. Then I need to improve my efficiency." "This isn't a joke." Kadrick set down his knife and fork with deliberate slowness. The sound echoed through the empty hall. "I don't joke, Garrett. I don't posture. I don't make threats I'm not prepared to execute. The king wants me at the capital so he can parade me around like a trained dog and remind everyone that he's still in charge. I refuse because I'm not in the business of participating in political theater that undermines my actual authority. And if he sends soldiers, then he'll lose soldiers, along with whatever credibility he has left. The two men stared at each other across the table. Garrett was one of the few people alive who had known Caedric before the title, before the reputation, before the carefully constructed armor of ruthlessness. He remembered the boy who had laughed occasionally, who had felt things deeply, who had not yet learned that emotions were liabilities to be excised. That boy was gone. What remained was something sharper. "You're going to die alone," Garrett said quietly. "You know that, right? All this power, all this control, and you'll die in this fortress surrounded by people who fear you and nobody who gives a damn." Caedric picked up his wine glass. Better to die alone and powerful than surrounded and weak. That's not a life. That's just survival. Survival is the only life that matters. He drank deeply, tasting the dark red vintage that cost more than most families earned in a year. The wine was excellent. It didn't change anything, but it was excellent. Garrett stood slowly. One day you're going to realize that you've spent so long building walls that you've trapped yourself inside them. Poetic. Wrong, but poetic. After Garrett left, Caedric remained at the table while servants cleared the dishes and extinguished candles throughout the hall. Darkness gathered in corners and pooled beneath the high ceilings. The fortress settled into its nighttime rhythms, all whispered conversations and distant footsteps. He thought about what Garrett had said, about dying alone, about walls. The truth was simpler and uglier than Garrett understood. Caedric had not built walls to keep people out. He had built them to keep himself contained. Everything violent and damaged and barely controlled that lived inside him needed those walls, needed the structure, needed the rules he enforced with absolute rigidity because the alternative was chaos. His father had been chaos. Unpredictable cruelty, random violence, arbitrary punishment delivered according to moods that shifted like weather patterns. Young Caedric had lived in constant fear, never knowing what would trigger the next beating, the next lesson in pain management. So he had learned to control everything, every variable, every outcome, every person. Control was not tyranny. Control was survival. And he would burn the entire kingdom before he let anyone threaten that. 3 days later, the king's messenger arrived at Blackmere with a formal summons sealed with the royal mark. Caedric received him in the throne room with appropriate ceremony. Banners hung from stone walls. Guards stood at attention. Everything about the space was designed to remind visitors that they were entering a place of power. The messenger bowed low. "Your Grace, I bring word from His Majesty." The Duke held up one hand. The messenger stopped talking immediately. Caedric descended from the raised dais with measured steps, each footfall deliberate. He stopped directly in front of the messenger, close enough that the man had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. "Tell the king I appreciate his invitation," Caedric said quietly. "Tell him I'm unavailable. Tell him I will be unavailable for the foreseeable future. Tell him that if he requires my presence, he is welcome to travel here personally, at which point we can discuss the nature of authority in territories he claims to govern but cannot actually control." The messenger's face went pale. "Your Grace, I cannot deliver such a message. It would be seen as honest communication? How refreshing." The messenger swallowed hard. "The king will consider this defiance. The king can consider whatever helps him sleep at night." Caedric turned away, dismissing the conversation. "You're free to return to the capital. Safe travels." He walked back to the throne and sat down. The messenger remained frozen for several seconds, clearly weighing his options and discovering they were all terrible. Finally, he bowed again and retreated quickly. After he left, Garrett emerged from a side entrance. "You just declared war." "No. I just refused to participate in someone else's fantasy about how power is distributed." "Same thing." Caedric leaned back in the throne, studying the empty hall. "Maybe, but if it is, then at least everyone will finally stop pretending that the king rules anything beyond the capital walls." Garrett moved closer. "What happens when he sends an army? Then we discover whether his generals are willing to die for political theater. And if they are, then we make them regret that willingness until there aren't enough survivors to maintain a functional military unit." The cold certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. Garrett had heard that tone before. It was the sound of someone who had already committed to violence and was simply waiting for the excuse to deploy it. "You know what your father would say?" Garrett asked carefully. "My father is dead. He'd say you've become exactly what he wanted." Kadrick's expression didn't change. "Then he'd be wrong. I'm what I had to become. There's a difference." "Is there?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from burning bridges. "Yes," Kadrick said finally. He enjoyed the cruelty. "I simply recognize its utility. That's not the comfort you think it is. I'm not looking for comfort. I'm looking for survival. And survival, as you constantly remind me, is the only life that matters." He stood abruptly and left the throne room, climbing the spiral stairs to his private chambers in the highest tower. The rooms were sparse by noble standards: a bed, a desk, maps and reports organized with obsessive precision. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. The space of someone who viewed comfort as another form of weakness. He stood at the window and looked out across his domain. Blackmere spread below like a stone crown, all sharp angles and defensive fortifications. Beyond the walls, the mountains rose in waves of granite and shadow. Somewhere beyond those mountains, the king sat in his palace and pretended he still controlled a kingdom. Let him pretend. Reality was what you could hold through force and will. Everything else was just ceremony. Kadrick turned away from the window and caught his own reflection in the polished steel mirror hanging beside the doorway. He studied himself for a moment, seeing what others saw. Cold eyes. Sharp features. The kind of face that made people instinctively check for exits. His father's face, but different, harder, more refined, less random in its violence. The old man had been a drunk and a sadist. Kadrick was neither. He was something more dangerous, a completely sober predator who approached cruelty as a mathematical problem requiring optimal solutions. He smiled at his reflection. The smile was empty. 2 weeks passed in careful tension. Trade caravans continued flowing through Blackmere. Tax revenue came in precisely on schedule. The northern lords remained quiet, which meant they were planning something. Garrett worried constantly. The servants walked on eggshells. Kadrick waited. Patience was another weapon. Then word arrived that Lord Ashford had requested his daughter's return, citing concerns for her welfare. The letter was polite, formal, completely transparent in its actual meaning. "Get my child out of your fortress before whatever you're planning explodes." Kadrick summoned Lady Meredith to his study. She entered with practiced grace, though he noticed the tension in her shoulders. "Your father wants you home." Meredith met his gaze. "So I've heard. You'll leave tomorrow. I'll provide armed escort to ensure your safe passage. That's generous of you. It's practical." Kadrick leaned back in his chair. "Your father has been a reliable ally. I prefer reliable allies to remain comfortable with our arrangement." She studied him carefully. "May I speak candidly, Your Grace?" "You may try. You're about to do something terrible, aren't you? Something that makes holding hostages more dangerous than useful." Hostage is such an unpleasant word. I prefer political guest. The semantics don't change the reality. "No." Kadrick stood and moved to the window. "But sometimes the reality changes the semantics. You're leaving because I'm about to redraw several territorial boundaries, and I'd prefer your father not feel compelled to choose sides in conflicts that don't actually require his involvement. By redraw boundaries, you mean conquer. I mean correct administrative errors that have persisted for too long. That's still conquering. Again, semantics." Meredith stepped closer. "For what it's worth, I think you're making a mistake. You could have been a great leader. Instead, you're going to be a cautionary tale." Kadrick turned to face her. Great leaders end up betrayed by the people they trusted. Cautionary tales end up in history books. "I'll take the books." She shook her head slowly. "You don't actually believe that. You're right. I don't believe anything. I simply act according to what works. That's incredibly sad. Effectiveness often is." He walked her to the door. "Safe travels, Lady Meredith. Give your father my regards and let him know that our arrangement remains mutually beneficial as long as he remembers which side of history is winning." After she left, Kadrick returned to his desk and pulled out detailed reports on the Northern Territories. The minor houses there had been growing bolder. Small infractions, testing boundaries, seeing how much they could get away with while the Duke was supposedly distracted by political conflicts with the crown. They had miscalculated. Badly. That night, while Blackmere slept beneath cold stars, Cedric met with his military commanders in the war room. 12 men hardened by years of border conflicts. Not one of them believed in honor or glory. They believed in victory and the paychecks that followed. Perfect subordinates. He laid out the campaign strategy with brutal efficiency. 3 houses would be eliminated simultaneously. Fast strikes. Overwhelming force. No prisoners except those useful for intelligence gathering. Estates would be seized, lands redistributed, survivors sent to the capital with messages written in blood. One commander asked the obvious question, "And if the king objects?" Then we remind him that objecting requires the ability to enforce consequences, which requires a military he no longer controls. The commanders exchanged glances. Someone finally said what everyone was thinking. "This isn't border enforcement. This is a coup." "No," Cedric corrected calmly. "A coup requires taking the throne. I have no interest in sitting in a palace and playing king. I want the freedom to govern my territories without interference from incompetent aristocrats who think authority derives from bloodlines rather than capability. So you're creating an independent duchy. I'm recognizing one that already exists." The meeting ended with orders distributed and timetables established. The campaign would begin in 4 days. Fast enough to maintain surprise. Slow enough to ensure nothing went wrong through rushed preparation. Cedric dismissed the commanders and remained alone in the war room while dawn approached. This was the moment Garrett had warned about. The point where power stopped being defensive and became expansionist, where survival transformed into conquest. The line was thinner than people believed. 3 days later, Lady Meredith's carriage disappeared down the mountain road, bearing her safely away from what was coming. Cedric watched from the battlements until the escort vanished into forest shadows. That afternoon, a new messenger arrived from the capital. This one carried not a letter, but a declaration. The king had officially declared House Vesperine in rebellion against the crown. All loyal houses were commanded to mobilize against Blackmere. The duke's titles were revoked, his lands forfeit, his life forfeit. Garrett read the declaration with visible dread. This is bad. No. Cedric took the document and held it over a candle flame until it caught fire. This is clarification. The entire kingdom just turned against you. The entire kingdom just revealed which nobles are capable of independent thought and which ones blindly follow orders from a throne that hasn't represented actual power in decades. You can't fight everyone. I don't need to fight everyone. Cedric watched the declaration burn to ash. I just need to break enough of them that the survivors recognize new management. That night, the final preparations were completed. Weapons sharpened, supplies loaded, routes confirmed. Cedric stood alone in the highest tower of Blackmere while the moon rose over mountains that had witnessed centuries of violence. The fortress blazed with light below. Torches lined every wall, every gate, every approach. They wanted to make him a rebel. Fine, he'd show them what rebellion looked like when practiced by someone who understood that half measures were just slowly executed failures. The campaign would begin at dawn. By week's end, 3 noble houses would cease to exist, and then the real war would start. Cedric felt nothing about this. No excitement, no dread. Just the cold mathematical certainty of someone who had spent 15 years learning that survival required the willingness to do what others called unforgivable. He descended from the tower as midnight approached. Somewhere in the darkness, Garrett waited with more warnings about caution and strategy and all the things that mattered to people who still believed civilization operated according to rules. Cedric had stopped believing in rules years ago. He believed in outcomes. And the outcome he wanted was simple: complete independence, absolute control, the freedom to govern without interference from people whose only qualification was being born into the right family. Was that ambition? Yes. Was it justified? Wrong question. It was necessary. That was the only justification that mattered. At dawn, the army of Blackmere marched north under iron banners that caught the light like polished blades. 3,000 soldiers moving with coordinated precision. Every man knew his target. Every unit understood its objective. No speeches, no ceremonies, just silent deployment. Ceadric rode at the front, armor dark against the rising sun. Behind him, Blackmere stood empty except for essential guards. Ahead, 3 noble houses prepared defenses they believed would hold. They were wrong. By sunset, the first estate was burning. By midnight, Lord Heron and his entire bloodline were dead. By dawn of the second day, 2 more houses fell. The survivors fled toward the capital, carrying stories of systematic slaughter delivered with mechanical efficiency. No prisoners, no mercy, no negotiation, just the absolute implementation of violence as policy. And Ceadric, riding through smoke and ash, felt nothing except the grim satisfaction of someone watching a plan execute exactly as designed. The kingdom would call him a monster. They would be correct. But monsters at least survived. And survival was the only victory that mattered. The smoke from burning estates drifted across the northern territories for 3 days before the wind finally shifted. Ceadric watched it dissipate from his command tent, studying maps marked with red crosses where noble houses used to exist. The campaign had been efficient, clinical, exactly what survival required when hesitation meant weakness and weakness meant death. His commanders reported casualty counts with the detached professionalism of men who understood that killing was just another form of labor requiring accurate documentation. 47 enemy soldiers dead, 19 wounded and interrogated. Every member of the ruling families eliminated except for 2 children under the age of 5, currently being transported to neutral territory because even Ceadric recognized that murdering infants created the wrong kind of legacy. Not morality. Strategy. Dead children made martyrs. Living orphans just made cautionary tales. Garrett arrived at the command tent as dawn broke over the scorched landscape. He looked exhausted, which made sense because he had spent the past 72 hours trying to convince various minor lords that pledging immediate loyalty to Blackmere was preferable to becoming the next target. Most had agreed. The ones who hadn't were no longer in a position to reconsider. "We need to talk," Garrett said without preamble. Ceadric continued studying the maps. "Then talk. The capital is mobilizing. Royal decree just went out. Every great house is being called to arms against you. Expected. The king is offering pardons to anyone who brings you in alive. Triple land grants to whoever delivers your head. Also expected. Ceadric, they're putting together an army, a real one. 20,000 soldiers at minimum. Good. That means I won't have to hunt them individually." Garrett slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the maps jump. "This isn't a joke. You've just declared war on the entire kingdom. There's no walking this back. No negotiating. You either win everything or lose everything, and the odds are not in your favor." Ceadric finally looked up. "The odds are never in anyone's favor. That's why most people lose. They wait for favorable conditions that never arrive instead of creating conditions through force. You're going to get yourself killed. Eventually. But not today. How can you be this calm? Because panic is what people do when they haven't prepared for the consequences of their own actions." Ceadric rolled up one of the maps with methodical precision. "I knew exactly what would happen when I moved north. I knew the king would respond. I knew the great houses would mobilize. I've been planning for this scenario since I inherited Blackmere 15 years ago." Garrett stared at him. 15 years? 15 years of building supply lines, fortifying positions, cultivating loyalty through fear and gold in equal measure. Every trade agreement, every marriage alliance, every minor concession I made to neighboring houses, all of it designed to position me for exactly this moment. You've been planning a civil war for 15 years. No. I've been planning to survive a civil war that was always inevitable. There's a difference. The distinction seemed important to Ceadric in ways that clearly didn't translate. He studied Garrett's expression, reading the moral conflict playing out behind his friend's eyes. This was the moment where people usually made speeches about right and wrong, about how there had to be another way, about how violence only created more violence. Ceadric had heard those speeches before. They were always delivered by people who had never actually faced the choice between compromising their survival or becoming what others called monstrous. "If you want to leave, leave now," Ceadric said quietly. "I won't stop you. I won't pursue you. You can ride to the capital, pledge loyalty to the king, and live out your life as a minor lord in someone else's kingdom." Garrett's jaw tightened. "You know I'm not going to do that. Then stop questioning the strategy and help me execute it. I can help you execute it and still think you're making a mistake. That's your privilege. Kadric moved past him toward the entrance of the command tent. Outside, soldiers were breaking camp with coordinated efficiency. 3,000 men preparing to march south toward whatever the kingdom threw at them next. Not one of them believed in honor or glory or any of the rhetoric nobility used to justify sending peasants to die for territorial disputes. They believed in gold. They believed in survival. They believed in the Duke who paid them on time and didn't ask them to die for abstract concepts. That was enough. The march south took 4 days through mountain passes still clogged with late spring snow. Kadric rode at the front, armor dark against white landscapes, saying nothing to anyone. His commanders understood the silence meant focus, not uncertainty. The soldiers understood it meant violence was coming, and talking wouldn't change the outcome. On the third night, scouts reported that the royal army had established position near the Thornwood Valley, blocking the main route to the capital. 23,000 soldiers according to preliminary counts. Mixed quality. Professional royal guards supplemented by conscripts from various noble houses who had responded to the king's summons with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The numbers were intimidating, the composition was not. Kadric studied the scout reports while his senior commanders gathered around the campaign map spread across a flat boulder. The valley was a natural choke point, forested hills on both flanks, open ground in the center, classic defensive position designed to force attackers into a killing field. They expect us to charge straight through, one commander observed. Because that's what desperate rebels do, another added. They throw everything at the center and hope momentum carries them through. Kadric traced his finger along the eastern ridge. What's the forest density here? Heavy. Old growth. Difficult terrain. Can cavalry navigate it? Not effectively. Then neither can their flanking forces. He looked up. We're not charging through the center. We're going to make them think we are, then collapse their eastern flank before they can reposition. That's a significant gamble. If they anticipate the move, they won't, because their commander is Lord Marshal Brennan, who learned warfare from textbooks written by men who never saw actual combat. He'll position according to doctrine, defend the center, protect the flanks, wait for the enemy to exhaust themselves against prepared defenses, and if you're wrong about him, then we adapt. But I'm not wrong. The confidence in his voice wasn't arrogance, it was calculation. Kadric had spent 15 years studying every military commander in the kingdom, learning their patterns, understanding their training, identifying their weaknesses. Brennan was competent but conventional. He followed rules because rules made sense in a world where everyone else also followed rules. Kadric didn't follow rules. He identified them, understood them, then systematically exploited the gaps between what rules prescribed and what reality demanded. The commanders dispersed to brief their units. Garrett remained behind, staring at the map like it was a death warrant. 3,000 against 23,000, he said quietly. Even with superior tactics, the math doesn't work. The math never works. That's why people lose. That's not an answer. No, it's a philosophy. Kadric folded the map. Wars aren't won by having more soldiers. They're won by breaking the enemy's will to continue fighting. Tomorrow we're not trying to kill 23,000 men. We're trying to convince 23,000 men that dying for a king who can't protect them is a bad investment. By killing how many? As many as necessary to make the point. Garrett looked at him for a long moment. Sometimes I forget that you're not actually human anymore. I'm exactly as human as I need to be. That night, Kadric stood alone at the edge of camp while soldiers slept in organized rows beneath cold stars. He thought about what Garrett had said, about being human, about the transformation that happened when survival required shutting down everything soft and vulnerable. His father had started that process. The world had finished it. There had been a version of Kadric once who felt things deeply, who cried when hurt, who wanted to be loved instead of feared. That version had died slowly across years of learning that sentiment was just another word for weakness, that caring made you controllable, that the only safe emotion was no emotion at all. He didn't miss that version of himself. Missing implied loss. Loss implied value. And the only value that mattered was survival. The battle began at dawn with manufactured chaos. Kaedric sent 1,000 soldiers charging directly at the royal center, banners raised, war horns blaring, creating exactly the kind of desperate frontal assault that conventional doctrine said rebels would attempt. The royal army responded perfectly. They reinforced the center. Archers positioned, infantry braced, cavalry held in reserve to exploit the inevitable breakthrough when momentum collapsed. Everything by the book, everything predictable. Meanwhile, Kaedric led 2,000 soldiers through the eastern forest in silence. No banners, no horns. Just controlled movement through difficult terrain toward the vulnerable flank that Brennan had left defended by conscripts who had been farmers 3 weeks ago. The soldiers moved with lethal efficiency. Every man understood his role, every unit knew its target. This was what separated professional violence from angry mobs. Organization, discipline, the willingness to do terrible things according to careful planning. They emerged from the tree line like a blade through silk. The conscripts broke within minutes, not because they were cowards, but because they were realists. They had been promised land grants and royal favor for defending the kingdom. Nobody had mentioned dying in a forest while professional soldiers carved through defensive lines with surgical precision. The eastern flank collapsed. Panic spread like infection. Kaedric pressed the advantage without hesitation, driving deeper into the royal formation while his frontal assault force disengaged and repositioned. The royal cavalry tried to respond but found themselves trapped between forest terrain and their own routing infantry. It became slaughter. Not because Kaedric enjoyed killing, but because incomplete victories just created future problems. Every soldier who escaped today was a soldier who would need to be fought again tomorrow. Better to break them completely now and eliminate the need for repetition. Lord Marshal Brennan died trying to rally his collapsing center. Honorable swam pointless. The kind of brave stupidity that made good stories and dead commanders. By noon, the battle was over. By evening, the casualty reports confirmed what Kaedric already knew. 4,000 royal soldiers dead, 8,000 scattered. The rest captured or sworn to Blackmere under terms that were generous by the standards of civil war and brutal by every other measure. His own losses, 300 dead, 500 wounded. The math had worked after all. That night, Kaedric stood among the wounded, moving through rows of soldiers being treated by field surgeons who worked with the grim efficiency of men accustomed to piecing together broken bodies. He said nothing to the injured, didn't offer comfort or praise, just moved through their ranks so they could see him, so they could understand that their commander didn't hide from the consequences of his orders. One soldier, gut-shot and dying slowly, grabbed Kaedric's arm as he passed. Was it worth it? Kaedric looked down at him. We won. That's not what I asked. Then you asked the wrong question. He pulled his arm free gently and continued walking. The soldier died sometime before midnight. His name went into the records alongside 300 others who had purchased Blackmere's independence with their lives. Garrett found Kaedric in his command tent after the casualties had been tallied and the prisoners secured. You know this isn't over. Brennan's army was just the first response. The great houses still have their own forces. I know. So, what's the plan? We force surrender before they can mobilize effectively. Kaedric unrolled a map of the capital region. The king is in his palace with minimal guard because he sent everything he had to Thornwood Valley. If we move fast, we can be at the capital gates within 6 days. You're going to assault the capital. No, I'm going to knock on the door and present terms. What terms? The only ones that matter. Complete autonomy for Blackmere and all territories under my control. The king keeps his throne and his dignity. I keep my independence and my armies. He'll never agree. Then he'll die. And we'll see if the next king is more reasonable. Garrett sat down heavily. You really are going to do this. You're going to march on the capital and demand the king's surrender to you. Not surrender, negotiate. There's a difference. The semantics won't matter when you're standing outside his palace with 3,000 soldiers. Exactly. Kaedric smiled. That's why he'll negotiate. The march to the capital took 5 days instead of 6 because Kaedric pushed the pace beyond what conventional wisdom said tired soldiers could maintain. They moved through neutral territories whose lords suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. They crossed rivers using bridges that remained mysteriously unguarded. They passed through towns where residents watched from windows but made no move to interfere. Fear was an excellent travel facilitator. On the fourth day, a delegation rode out from one of the great houses to negotiate safe passage through their territory. The delegation consisted of 3 elderly lords who had survived multiple regimes by being very good at recognizing which way political winds were blowing. Duke Vesperine, the lead lord, began with practiced diplomacy. "We come bearing messages from the capital." "You come bearing your own survival instincts," Kaedric interrupted. "You want to know if pledging neutrality now will keep your estates intact when this is over." The lord's carefully prepared speech died in his throat. "That is not an inaccurate assessment. My terms are simple. Stay neutral. Don't interfere. Don't send intelligence to the capital about our movements. When the dust settles, we'll discuss what tribute arrangements look like in the new political landscape. And if the king wins, then you can tell him you were coerced and beg forgiveness. That's the beauty of neutrality. Plausible deniability." The lords exchanged glances. These were men who had spent decades navigating political complexity, who understood that survival often meant backing multiple horses and hoping at least one finished the race. "We have an agreement," the lead lord said finally. "Excellent." Kaedric gestured toward the south. "There's a caravan carrying food supplies following behind my main force. You're welcome to purchase from them at reasonable prices. My soldiers are well fed, but your people might appreciate access to northern grain. That is, generous. That's practical. Hungry territories create desperate populations. Desperate populations create instability. I prefer stable trading partners." After the delegation left, Garrett rode up beside Kaedric. "You just turned a potential enemy into a neutral party by offering them grain?" "I turned a potential enemy into a neutral party by demonstrating that cooperation with Blackmere is more profitable than opposition. The grain is just the delivery mechanism." "You're buying loyalty." "No. I'm renting predictability. Loyalty doesn't exist. Only mutually beneficial arrangements that last as long as the benefits outweigh the costs." "That's incredibly cynical. That's incredibly accurate." Kaedric urged his horse forward. "The difference between cynicism and realism is that realism produces consistent results." They reached the capital outskirts on the evening of the 5th day. The city sprawled across the river valley like a monument to everything aristocracy valued. Grand architecture, elaborate gardens, marble statues honoring dead kings who had accomplished little beyond being born into the right family. Kaedric studied it from the hills and felt nothing except mild contempt. The city gates were closed, guards lined the walls, archers positioned at intervals. The defensive posture of a regime that had just learned its primary army was destroyed and its authority was being actively challenged. Kaedric made camp a mile outside Arrow Range and sent a messenger to the palace with terms written in language simple enough that even frightened aristocrats could understand. The message was brief, direct, completely devoid of diplomatic flourish. "I'm here to negotiate independence for Blackmere and associated territories. You have 3 days to send a delegation. Refusal means I start burning supply warehouses until someone with actual authority decides to have a conversation." The messenger returned within hours, pale and shaking, carrying a royal summons demanding Kaedric present himself at the palace to answer charges of treason. Kaedric read it once, then used it to start a campfire. "The king doesn't understand his situation yet," he told Garrett. "That's fine. Understanding usually requires demonstration." On the second day, Kaedric sent 500 soldiers to occupy the grain warehouses on the city's western edge. No violence, no looting. Just professional occupation with posted notices explaining that all food supplies were now under Blackmere administration until negotiations concluded satisfactorily. The city began to panic, not because of immediate starvation, but because the presence of armed soldiers inside the capital perimeter shattered the illusion of royal control. If Blackmere forces could occupy warehouses, they could occupy anything. The nobility started sending private messages to their estates. Merchants began hoarding goods. Panic buying started in the markets. On the third day, a delegation finally rode out from the palace. 6 lords in formal regalia, looking like they had dressed for a funeral. The lead lord was Duke Marcellus Thorne, one of the kingdom's senior nobility and someone Kaedric vaguely remembered as competent. They met in a neutral pavilion erected specifically for the purpose, guards on both sides, tension thick enough to choke on. Duke Vesperine, Marcellus began carefully. The king has sent us to discuss— Let me save you some time, Caedric interrupted. I don't care what the king wants to discuss. I'm here to state terms. You either accept them, counteroffer reasonably, or go back to the palace and prepare for a siege that you will lose. Marcellus's carefully prepared diplomatic opening crumbled. This is highly irregular. This is incredibly regular. It's called negotiating from strength. I have the army. I control the food supply. I just destroyed your primary military force. That gives me the leverage to set terms rather than beg for concessions. The king will never agree to independence. Then the king will learn what disagreement costs. One of the other lords leaned forward. You're threatening to starve the capital? I'm explaining natural consequences. Food warehouses under my control means food distribution follows my priorities. If those priorities don't include feeding a city whose leadership refuses to negotiate in good faith, well, that's unfortunate, but predictable. Marcellus studied him carefully. You've thought this through. I've thought through every scenario. The only variable is how many people die before you accept what's already inevitable, which is Blackmere operates independently. I don't pay royal taxes. I don't follow royal decrees. I don't send soldiers to fight in the king's wars. In exchange, I don't march on the palace. I don't disrupt trade routes, and I don't encourage other territories to follow my example. That's not negotiation. That's extortion. Welcome to politics. The only difference between extortion and diplomacy is whether historians like you afterward. The negotiations continued for 3 hours. Back and forth, proposals and counterproposals, the kind of careful verbal combat that aristocrats learned from childhood. Caedric participated with detached efficiency, recognizing that this was just another form of warfare conducted with words instead of swords. The core issue kept circling back to the same problem. The king couldn't grant independence without setting a precedent that other territories would follow. The kingdom couldn't function if every powerful duke decided to stop obeying central authority. Caedric's response was simple and brutal. That sounds like a problem for the king to solve, not a reason for me to compromise my survival. By evening, they had reached a preliminary framework. Blackmere would remain technically part of the kingdom, but with autonomous authority over internal governance, military deployment, and taxation. A face-saving compromise that gave Caedric everything he wanted while allowing the king to pretend he hadn't just surrendered to a rebellious subordinate. We'll present these terms to His Majesty, Marcellus said finally. But I make no promises. Then I make no promises about what happens when those warehouses run out of food. After the delegation left, Garrett approached looking more exhausted than Caedric had ever seen him. You actually did it. You backed the kingdom into accepting your independence. We'll see. Acceptance in principle isn't the same as signed agreements. Still, this is more than anyone expected. This is exactly what I expected. Caedric watched the delegation ride back toward the city gates. Power doesn't care about expectations. It cares about leverage. I had leverage. They didn't. The outcome was mathematical. Nothing about this was mathematical. You gambled everything. No. I calculated risk against potential outcomes and acted accordingly. That's not gambling. That's strategy. Garrett shook his head slowly. Sometimes I wonder if you actually believe the things you say, or if you've just convinced yourself that eliminating emotion makes you stronger. Both, probably. That's not the comfort you think it is. I'm not looking for comfort. The next day passed in tense waiting. Soldiers maintained their positions around the warehouses. The city remained locked down. Rumors spread through the capital about the duke who had beaten a royal army and now held the kingdom's food supply hostage. Caedric spent the day reviewing supply inventories and calculating how long he could maintain the occupation before logistics became problematic. The answer was approximately 45 days, which was much longer than the city could go without bread. That evening, the palace finally sent word. The king would sign the agreement. Blackmere would become autonomous. Independence purchased through applied violence and careful logistics. Garrett found Caedric in his command tent after the announcement. You won. Caedric looked up from the documents he was reviewing. I survived. That's different. How? Winning implies the conflict is over. Survival just means you made it through this round. There will always be another round. That's exhausting. That's reality. The formal signing ceremony took place 3 days later in a palace chamber filled with witnesses and dripping with ceremony. The king sat on his throne looking exactly like someone who had just been forced to acknowledge his own irrelevance. Cadric signed the documents with the same detached efficiency he applied to everything else. No speeches, no dramatic moments, just signatures and seals making official what violence had already established. Afterward, Duke Marcellus approached him in the corridor outside the chamber. "You should know that half the nobility wants you dead." "Only half?" "I'm disappointed. I'm serious. This agreement won't last. The moment they see weakness, they'll move against you. Then I won't show weakness. Nobody's perfect forever." Cadric turned to face him directly. "I don't need to be perfect forever. I just need to be dangerous enough that attacking me looks worse than tolerating me. That's sustainable. For how long? As long as necessary." He left the palace and returned to his army camped outside the city. The soldiers were already preparing for the march back to Blackmere. Home. Though Kedrick had long ago learned that home was just another word for the place you defended most viciously. Garrett rode beside him as they departed the capital. "So what now?" "Now we go back and prepare for whatever comes next." "Which is?" "Unknown, but probably violent. That's specific. That's realistic." Cadric studied the road ahead, watching his army move north in organized columns. "The kingdom knows I can win battles. Now they need to learn that I can win the peace. That's harder." "How do you win peace?" "Same way you win anything else. Superior force applied consistently until opposition becomes too expensive to maintain." They rode in silence for a while. The capital disappeared behind them. The road stretched ahead through territories that now answered to Blackmere first and the crown second, if at all. "Can I ask you something?" Garrett said finally. "If I say no, you'll ask anyway." "Fair point." Garrett hesitated. "Do you ever regret it? Becoming this? This? Whatever you are now, this version of yourself that doesn't feel things." Cadric considered the question with the same analytical detachment he applied to everything else. "Regret requires believing you had better options." "I didn't. My father taught me that sentiment was weakness. The world confirmed it. I adapted. That's not transformation. That's survival." "That sounds lonely." "Loneliness is what people feel when they need connection." "I need control. It's different." "Is it better?" "Better is subjective. More effective is measurable. And yes, this version of me is significantly more effective at surviving than whatever I was before." "Before?" "Before I learned that the only person you can trust is yourself, and even that trust should be limited." Garrett looked at him for a long moment. "You know what the truly sad thing is? I don't think you're wrong." "About what?" "About any of it. The world really is that brutal. Sentiment really does make you vulnerable. Mercy really can get you killed. You're not broken. You're just honest about how power actually works. And that makes you sad?" "It makes me wish it weren't true." "Wishing doesn't change reality," Cadric said. "It just wastes time you could spend adapting to it." They continued north while spring turned the landscape green with the kind of optimistic renewal that nature always delivered regardless of how much blood soaked into the soil. Behind them, the capital struggled with its new reality. Ahead, Blackmere waited like a fortress of certainty, in a kingdom learning that authority was only meaningful if backed by force. Cadric felt nothing about the victory. No satisfaction, no pride. Just the cold recognition that he had survived another challenge and now needed to prepare for the next one. That night they made camp in neutral territory. Cadric stood apart from the soldiers, studying the northern horizon, where Blackmere waited beyond mountains and forests. His domain now, secured through violence and negotiation in exactly the proportions that reality demanded. He thought about what Garrett had said about loneliness, about connection, about whether eliminating emotion had made him stronger or just different. The answer didn't matter. Strong, different, broken, complete, all just words that changed nothing about the fundamental equation. He was alive. His enemies were dead or neutralized. Blackmere was secure. Everything else was commentary delivered by people who had never faced the choice between becoming what they feared and becoming what they mourned. Cadric had made his choice. He would live with it, or more accurately, he would survive with it, which was the only outcome that mattered. The army reached Blackmere 6 days later. The fortress stood above the cliffs exactly as he had left it, black stone and iron banners, the architecture of dominance carved into mountains that had witnessed centuries of rulers who thought they were permanent. None of them had been. Kedrick wouldn't be either. But while he lasted, he would control everything within reach and prepare for the inevitable moment when someone faster, smarter, or luckier came to test whether his reputation matched reality. That was the thing about power. It didn't care about fairness or justice or any of the concepts people use to make themselves feel better about hierarchy. It only cared about who held it and who wanted it. Kedrick held it. Everyone else wanted it. The mathematics were simple. The execution would be brutal. And somewhere in that brutal execution, he had become exactly what his father had wanted, someone who chose survival over sentiment, control over connection, effectiveness over emotion. The transformation was complete. The consequences were irreversible. And Kedrick Vesperine, Duke of Blackmere, ruler of territories purchased in blood and maintained through systematic intimidation, felt nothing about any of it except the cold certainty that he had done what was necessary, which was the only feeling that mattered. The only feeling he still allowed himself to have. Blackmere had never felt like home, but it had always felt like certainty. Stone walls that had stood for 3 centuries. Iron gates that had never been breached. Corridors where Kedrick knew every shadow, every servant, every potential threat. Control lived in these halls the way other fortresses held history or tradition. Control was what made survival possible. That certainty shattered on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the return from the capital. Kedrick was in the war room reviewing trade agreements when the first report arrived. A merchant caravan ambushed on the northern road. 12 wagons burned. 23 guards dead. The attackers had moved with professional precision, targeting specific goods and leaving no survivors except one messenger with a sealed letter pinned to his chest with a dagger. The letter was addressed to the Duke. Inside, written in elegant script that made the words somehow worse, was a simple message. Your dominance ends where our patience begins. No signature, no house seal, just the promise wrapped in ambiguity. Kedrick studied the letter with the analytical detachment of someone examining a chess position after an unexpected move. Someone was testing him. The question was whether this was opportunistic banditry dressed up as rebellion or something more calculated. The answer arrived 6 hours later when 3 separate grain warehouses in Blackmere's eastern territories caught fire simultaneously. Professional arson, coordinated timing, the kind of systematic destruction that required planning and resources beyond what random bandits possessed. Garrett arrived at the war room as reports flooded in. We have a problem. Multiple problems, Kedrick corrected. This isn't random. Someone is targeting our supply infrastructure. Any idea who? Everyone who smiled at the capital while signing treaties they never intended to honor? That's half the kingdom. Exactly. Which means we need to identify the specific half that's currently burning my warehouses before they escalate to something more ambitious. Like what? Like realizing that killing me solves more problems than burning grain. Kedrick deployed scouts throughout the northern territories with orders to gather intelligence on troop movements, unusual gatherings, any sign of organized resistance. The reports that returned over the next 48 hours painted a picture more disturbing than simple rebellion. 5 minor houses were coordinating attacks, not the ones Kedrick had destroyed during the northern campaign, but their neighbors. The survivors who had watched their peers burn and learned exactly the wrong lesson from the experience. They had concluded that Kedrick was powerful but not invincible, dangerous but not omnipresent, and most critically, that working together might accomplish what individual houses could never achieve alone. They were planning to kill him, not in open battle where his tactical superiority mattered, but through systematic destruction of everything that made Blackmere function. Supply lines, trade routes, the economic infrastructure that transformed military power into sustainable governance. It was smarter than Kedrick had expected, which meant someone intelligent was organizing them. The revelation of who arrived on the 4th day when one of Kedrick's spies returned from the eastern territories with information purchased through methods nobody asked about. The conspiracy had a center, a coordinator, someone with enough credibility to unite houses that normally competed for resources and status. Lord Garrett Thorne, Kedrick's only friend. The spy delivered the intelligence with professional detachment, laying out evidence that included intercepted correspondence, Witness testimony from servants, financial records showing gold transfers to known mercenaries. The documentation was thorough, comprehensive, completely damning. Kadrick read through it twice while something cold and mechanical activated in his chest. Not pain, not betrayal, just the recognition that he had made a fundamental miscalculation about the one variable he had assumed was constant. Garrett had been planning this for months, since before the capital, since before the Northern Campaign, possibly since the moment Kadrick had refused the king's summons and committed to the path that ended with independence purchased through violence. The document suggested Garrett believed Kadrick had become too dangerous, too ruthless, too willing to sacrifice anything for control, that the Duke who had once fought for survival had transformed into something monstrous that needed to be stopped before he destroyed everything in pursuit of absolute dominance. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Garrett had betrayed him to save the kingdom from someone who had only become what survival demanded. Kadrick sat alone in the war room for an hour after dismissing the spy, studying the evidence and calculating responses with the mechanical precision that fear and emotion would have disrupted. The situation was clear. Garrett had access to every defensive plan, every supply route, every strategic weakness. He knew how Kadrick thought, how he planned, how he responded to threats. Garrett was the perfect weapon to use against him, which meant Garrett had to die. The thought arrived without hesitation or regret, just cold mathematics. Sentiment was what got people killed. Friendship was a luxury purchased with vulnerability. Kadrick had spent 15 years eliminating both. The fact that this particular elimination felt different was irrelevant. Different didn't change necessary. He summoned his commanders that evening and laid out the situation with brutal efficiency. One of their own had turned traitor. The conspiracy needed to be crushed completely. No survivors, no mercy. The standard protocol for dealing with rebellion, except this time the target was someone they all knew. The commanders received the orders without comment. These were men who understood that loyalty to Blackmere meant loyalty to whoever controlled it. And right now, Kadrick controlled it with an iron fist that didn't loosen just because friendship complicated the execution. One commander asked the obvious question, "Do you want him alive?" Kadrick considered it. Garrett alive meant intelligence gathering, interrogation, learning the full extent of the conspiracy. Garrett dead meant certainty and the elimination of someone who knew too much to be contained safely. "No," Kadrick said. "Dead is cleaner." The operation launched before dawn. 50 soldiers moving silently through Blackmere toward Garrett's chambers in the eastern wing. Professional, coordinated. The kind of violence that happened in darkness before most people woke up to discover the world had changed while they slept. Kadrick accompanied them. Not because he needed to supervise, but because some executions required personal attention. Garrett had been his friend. Whatever that word meant in a world where friendship was just strategic alliance wearing sentiment as camouflage. The least Kadrick could do was watch him die. They breached the door simultaneously, soldiers flooding the room with drawn weapons, an absolute commitment to overwhelming force. The room was empty, not recently abandoned, long empty. Dust on the furniture, no personal effects. The space of someone who had left days ago and covered their tracks with professional thoroughness. Kadrick stood in the doorway while soldiers searched adjacent rooms and found nothing. Garrett was gone. Escaped. Currently coordinating the conspiracy from somewhere beyond Blackmere's immediate reach. The cold mechanism in Kadrick's chest clicked forward another notch. Garrett hadn't just betrayed him. Garrett had anticipated the response and moved first, which meant everything Kadrick thought he controlled was already compromised at levels he hadn't fully calculated. Every plan Garrett knew, every defensive position, every contingency protocol, all of it potentially leaked to enemies who were currently using that intelligence to systematically dismantle what Kadrick had spent 15 years building. The scope of the betrayal expanded like poison through water. He returned to the war room and began the brutal work of damage assessment. Which supply routes were compromised? Which defensive plans needed immediate revision? Which personnel might be loyal to Garrett rather than the duchy? The list grew longer with every analysis until Kadrick was staring at the reality that he had trusted someone who had spent months preparing to destroy him. The question that mattered wasn't why. It was what now? Reports continued flooding in throughout the morning. Another caravan ambushed, a garrison in the Eastern Territory overrun by forces that knew exactly where the defenses were weakest, a warehouse burned with timing that suggested inside knowledge of guard rotations. Garrett was using everything he knew, and he knew everything. By afternoon, Kadrick had implemented emergency protocols that assumed every existing defensive plan was compromised. New patrol routes, randomized guard rotations, supply convoys with unpredictable schedules, the kind of systematic paranoia that transformed efficient operations into cautious survival. It would work, temporarily. But the longer-term problem was strategic. Garrett wasn't just attacking infrastructure. He was demonstrating to every noble house in the kingdom that Kadrick could be hurt, that Blackmere had weaknesses, that the Duke, who seemed invincible, was actually vulnerable to coordinated resistance. The perception of power mattered as much as actual power, maybe more, and Garrett was systematically destroying that perception. The realization arrived with crystalline clarity. Kadrick was losing control of the narrative. Every successful attack reinforced the idea that Blackmere could be challenged. Every burned warehouse proved that the Duke's dominance was circumstantial rather than inevitable. He needed to respond, decisively, in a way that reminded everyone why opposing him was suicide, regardless of how many houses banded together. The strategy took shape over the next 6 hours while Kadrick reviewed intelligence reports and military capabilities. He couldn't defend everywhere simultaneously. Garrett would keep hitting soft targets and bleeding resources until Blackmere's military advantage eroded through economic exhaustion. Defense was losing. Offense was the only option. Kadrick summoned his remaining commanders and laid out a plan that made them exchange uncomfortable glances. He was going to abandon defensive positions in the Eastern Territories entirely, pull all forces back to Blackmere proper, let Garrett and his conspirators believe they were winning, then strike directly at the conspiracy's center with overwhelming force concentrated at a single point. One commander voiced the concern everyone shared. That's a significant risk. If the attack fails, we've surrendered territory and shown weakness. If the attack succeeds, we eliminate the conspiracy's leadership and prove that coordination doesn't matter when I can kill everyone involved faster than they can consolidate gains. And if Lord Garrett anticipates this, then we discover whether he knows me well enough to predict I'd sacrifice territory for a chance at his throat. The room fell silent. These were soldiers who had followed Kadrick through multiple campaigns. They understood he operated with a kind of calculated ruthlessness that made most commanders seem hesitant by comparison. But this was different. This was Kadrick gambling everything on a single decisive strike, based on incomplete intelligence against an enemy who knew exactly how he thought. The mathematics were terrible, which was exactly why Garrett wouldn't expect it. Sometimes the only winning move was the one that looked like suicide. The Eastern Territories were evacuated over 48 hours. Soldiers withdrew in organized columns, while civilians were relocated to Blackmere proper, or dispersed to neutral territories with enough supplies to survive the coming chaos. Everything that couldn't be moved was destroyed. Buildings burned, wells poisoned, fields salted, scorched earth withdrawal. The kind of strategic retreat that looked like defeat but was actually preparation. Garrett's forces moved in immediately, occupying abandoned positions and claiming victory. Reports indicated celebrations in the conspiracy camps, lords toasting their success. Soldiers convinced they had broken the Wolf of Blackmere through coordinated pressure. Let them celebrate. Kadrick spent 3 days gathering intelligence on exactly where Garrett was coordinating operations. The conspiracy had established a command center in the ruins of one of the noble estates Kadrick had destroyed during the Northern Campaign. Poetic location. Terrible defensive position for anyone who didn't expect a direct assault through difficult terrain. The strike force departed Blackmere on the 4th night. 1,500 soldiers moving in absolute silence through mountain passes and forest routes that conventional military doctrine said were impassable. They moved anyway because impassable just meant difficult, and difficult meant unexpected. Kadrick led from the front, not because he was suicidal, but because some operations required the commander's presence to maintain momentum when exhaustion and doubt started degrading effectiveness. The soldiers followed because they understood the Duke didn't ask anyone to go anywhere he wouldn't go himself. They reached the target just before dawn. The conspiracy's command center was exactly where intelligence had indicated, fortified but not heavily. guarded, but not paranoid. The defensive posture of people who believed their enemy was miles away, reeling from territorial losses. Kedrick gave the signal. The assault was brutally efficient. Soldiers poured through weak points with coordinated precision, while archers provided covering fire from elevated positions. The defenders responded quickly, but not quickly enough. Within minutes, the outer perimeter collapsed. Within an hour, the main building was breached. Kedrick entered through smoke and chaos, moving through corridors lined with bodies while his soldiers cleared rooms with systematic violence. The conspiracy's leadership was trying to evacuate through a rear exit when Blackmere forces cut off the escape route. Garrett was among them. Kedrick saw him across the burning courtyard and felt that cold mechanism in his chest click into its final position. This was the moment where everything either validated or collapsed, where betrayal met consequence, where friendship transformed into corpses. Garrett saw him at the same moment. For 3 seconds they stood frozen, separated by smoke and bodies, and the ruins of whatever connection they had once shared. Then Garrett drew his sword. "Kedrick," he said quietly, "we can end this without more killing." "No, we can't. Listen to me. You've become exactly what you feared. You're destroying everything to maintain control over nothing that matters. I'm destroying people who betrayed me." "That's not fear. That's maintenance. This isn't maintenance. This is madness. You've turned Blackmere into a prison where the only person trapped is you. Better trapped and alive than free and dead." Garrett shook his head slowly. "There's no difference anymore. You've been dead inside since your father finished breaking you. Everything since then has just been the corpse moving." The words hit harder than they should have because some part of Kedrick recognized the truth underneath the accusation. He had spent 15 years eliminating everything vulnerable, everything human, everything that made connection possible. What remained was effective but hollow, powerful but empty. A corpse moving. Maybe Garrett was right. But right didn't change necessary. Kedrick drew his blade. "Last chance. Surrender, and I'll make it quick." "I can't surrender. Not to what you've become. Then die as what you were." They fought in the burning courtyard while the conspiracy collapsed around them. Garrett was skilled, trained by the same weapons masters, familiar with every technique Kedrick used. But familiarity wasn't the same as commitment, and Kedrick had stopped hesitating years ago. The fight lasted 90 seconds. Garrett died with Kedrick's blade through his chest, blood spreading across armor while his eyes held something that might have been pity or grief or just exhausted resignation. "You could have been more," Garrett whispered. "Instead, you chose this. I chose survival. Everything else was luxury. That's what you tell yourself. But we both know you're lying." Garrett died before Kedrick could respond. The courtyard fell silent except for crackling flames and distant sounds of soldiers finishing the work of eliminating resistance. Kedrick stood over Garrett's body while something unfamiliar moved through his chest. Not grief. Grief required caring, and he had eliminated that years ago. Something else. Some recognition that he had just killed the last person who remembered who he had been before transformation. The last witness to the version of himself that had believed friendship was possible. Now that witness was dead. And Kedrick was truly alone. The victory was complete. The conspiracy destroyed. Every lord involved either dead or captured. The eastern territories could be reoccupied within days. Blackmere's dominance was re-established through overwhelming violence concentrated at a single point exactly as planned. The mathematics worked. The strategy succeeded. Everything went according to calculation. So why did it feel like losing? Kedrick returned to Blackmere 3 days later with prisoners and evidence of complete victory over forces that had tried to use coordination as a weapon against superior individual power. The fortress received him with appropriate ceremony. Banners flying, guards at attention, the theater of dominance that reminded everyone who controlled what. But the fortress felt different now, emptier. Not because of personnel losses, but because something had broken that went beyond military casualties or strategic setbacks. Kedrick had eliminated the last person who knew him as anything other than the Duke. The last connection to whatever he had been before survival demanded transformation. He stood in the war room that night, surrounded by maps marking territories secured through violence and strategies written in the blood of people who had challenged his authority. Everything he had fought for. Everything he had sacrificed to maintain. The empire of control he had built from broken pieces and ruthless necessity. It should have felt like victory. It felt like a tomb. The reports continued arriving over subsequent days. The eastern territories were being reoccupied. Trade routes reopened. Lords who had remained neutral during the conspiracy were sending tribute and pledges of loyalty. The kingdom was learning once again that challenging Blackmere meant death delivered with mechanical efficiency. Everything was returning to how it should be. Except Kaedric couldn't shake Garrett's final words. "You could have been more." The accusation echoed through empty halls while he reviewed administrative documents and made decisions that affected thousands of lives with the same detached efficiency he had cultivated for 15 years. He was effective, powerful, in complete control of everything within his domain, and completely hollow. The realization arrived slowly, like dawn through fog. He had spent 15 years building walls to keep himself safe, and those walls had become a prison more absolute than any enemy could construct. He had eliminated vulnerability so thoroughly that he had eliminated everything else too. Connection. Trust. Whatever made survival feel like something other than prolonged execution. His father had taught him that sentiment was weakness. The world had confirmed it. But maybe both of them had been wrong about what strength actually meant. Maybe real strength wasn't eliminating vulnerability. Maybe it was surviving with it intact. The thought was dangerous, destabilizing, the kind of realization that threatened to unmake everything he had become. Kaedric stood at the window of his private chambers, looking out across Blackmere, while night settled over the fortress like a shroud. The empire he controlled, the power he maintained, the absolute dominance purchased through systematic elimination of everything soft. It was everything he had fought for. And it meant nothing, because Garrett had been right. He was dead inside. A corpse moving through motions that looked like life but were just sophisticated decay. The question that mattered now was whether that could change or if transformation was permanent once you crossed certain thresholds. Whether someone who had spent 15 years eliminating humanity could reclaim it, or if that capacity died the moment you decided survival mattered more than everything else. Kaedric didn't know the answer. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't know what to do. The cold mechanism that had governed every decision suddenly seemed insufficient, inadequate, a tool that worked perfectly for survival but failed completely at whatever came after survival was secured. He had won. He had survived. He had achieved everything he set out to accomplish, and discovered that accomplishment without connection was just organized emptiness. The realization should have devastated him. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he had thought in years. Somewhere in the darkness, the future waited with all its terrible possibilities. Lords who would test him again. Betrayals that would require responses. The endless maintenance of power that had consumed 15 years and would consume however many remained. But maybe there was another option. Maybe instead of just surviving, he could try to live. The thought was terrifying. Living required vulnerability. Vulnerability meant risk. Risk meant potential loss. Everything his father had beaten out of him, everything the world had confirmed was suicide. But Garrett's corpse in a burning courtyard suggested maybe suicide came in multiple forms, and the one Kaedric had chosen was just slower and more socially acceptable. He stood at the window until dawn broke gray and cold across the mountains. Blackmere woke around him with all its routines and rituals and the systematic operation of power that required constant maintenance. The empire demanded its duke. The duke was discovering he might need to become something other than what empire required. The mathematics of that transformation were unclear. The necessity was becoming undeniable. And Kaedric Vesperine, who had spent 15 years becoming what survival demanded, now faced a choice more terrifying than any battle. He could continue being the corpse that moved, or he could risk becoming human again. The first option was safe. The second was suicide, which meant the second was the only real choice, because anything else was just prolonged death wearing power as a disguise. The decision to become human again arrived with consequences faster than Kaedric had calculated. Humanity, he discovered, was not something you simply chose like selecting different armor. It required dismantling defenses that had kept him alive for 15 years. And dismantling defenses in a world full of predators was the definition of suicide. The first sign came 3 days after Garrett's death, when reports arrived of unusual troop movements along the southern border. Not from the conspiracy remnants, which had been thoroughly eliminated, but from the capital itself. Royal banners, professional soldiers, the kind of military deployment that suggested the king had finally grown tired of tolerating Blackmere's independence. The treaty they had signed was being ignored, because treaties only mattered when both parties had equal power to enforce them, and the king had apparently decided that Ciedric's recent internal conflict meant that power balance had shifted. Wrong calculation, but understandable. Ciedric studied the intelligence reports in the war room while something that might have been fatigue pressed against his skull. The campaign against Garrett had been expensive, not just in soldiers and resources, but in the kind of psychological exhaustion that came from killing someone who had once mattered. He was operating at diminished capacity, and everyone knew it. The predators were circling. His commanders gathered for the briefing with expressions that suggested they already understood what was coming. Another war. More violence. The endless cycle of domination and resistance that characterized every empire built on force rather than consent. "How many soldiers is the king sending?" one commander asked. 30,000. Maybe more. The room fell silent. That was 3 times what they had faced at Thornwood Valley, a force large enough to overwhelm Blackmere through sheer numerical advantage regardless of tactical superiority. "We can defend the fortress," another commander offered. "The walls have never been breached. Defending means siege. Siege means starvation. Starvation means we lose slowly instead of quickly. So what's the alternative?" Ciedric traced his finger across the map, following the route the Royal Army would need to take. "They'll march through the Crescent Pass. Narrow terrain, limited maneuverability. If we hit them there with everything we have, we can break their advance before they reach open ground. That's our entire military force committed to a single engagement," a third commander said carefully. "If we lose, there's no fallback position. If we lose, there's no Blackmere. The mathematics are simple." The commanders exchanged glances. They had followed Ciedric through multiple campaigns and learned to trust his tactical instincts even when those instincts looked like madness. But this was different. This was gambling everything on one decisive battle against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. The kind of desperation move that either became legendary victory or cautionary tale. No middle ground. Ciedric dismissed the commanders and stood alone in the war room while dawn light crept through the high windows. He studied the maps with the analytical detachment that had governed every decision for 15 years, looking for advantages that mathematics said didn't exist. Superior tactics could offset numerical disadvantage. Terrain could multiply force effectiveness. But at some point the numbers became absolute and strategy transformed into prayer. He was approaching that point. The realization arrived with crystalline clarity. He might actually lose this. All the power carefully accumulated, all the control obsessively maintained. All of it could evaporate in a single afternoon when 30,000 soldiers crashed against 3,000 and mathematics reasserted dominance over willpower. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like clarity. Because if he was going to lose everything anyway, he might as well lose it fighting for something other than just survival. Might as well discover whether humanity could be reclaimed even in the middle of violence that required its complete absence. The concept was insane, which meant it was probably necessary. That afternoon, Ciedric did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He called an assembly of every soldier in Blackmere and spoke to them not as a commander issuing orders, but as someone explaining why dying tomorrow might actually matter. The soldiers gathered in the main courtyard while Ciedric stood on the elevated platform where executions usually happened. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This was where justice got delivered through violence, where betrayal met consequence, where the Duke demonstrated that opposing him meant death. Now he was standing there asking them to die for him. The difference was subtle, but absolute. "We're outnumbered," Ciedric began without preamble. "The king is sending 30,000 soldiers to crush us because we had the audacity to demand independence. They're coming through Crescent Pass in 4 days. We'll meet them there with everything we have. Most of you won't survive. Neither will I." The courtyard remained silent. These were professional soldiers who understood mathematics as well as anyone. 3,000 against 30,000 meant death regardless of tactical advantages. I'm telling you this because you deserve honesty, Kaedric continued. For 15 years, I've asked you to follow orders without explanation, to kill without question, to serve a duke who treated you like weapons instead of people. That ends today. He paused, studying the faces looking up at him, soldiers who had followed him through multiple campaigns, who had trusted his judgment even when that judgment looked suicidal, who had every right to abandon him now that survival seemed impossible. If you want to leave, leave now. Take whatever supplies you need. I won't pursue you. I won't punish you. I won't even remember your names. Because dying for someone else's empire is the definition of stupid. And I've been asking you to do exactly that for years. Nobody moved. But I'm not asking anymore, Kaedric said. I'm explaining why I'm going to that pass regardless of who follows. Because the king sending 30,000 soldiers means he thinks force alone determines outcomes. That numbers trump will. That people are just resources to be calculated and deployed like grain or gold. He's wrong. People aren't resources. They're the only thing that actually matters. And if we die proving that to him, at least we die demonstrating that some things can't be purchased through overwhelming force. The speech was terrible by conventional standards. No rhetoric, no appeals to honor or glory, just blunt honesty about mathematics and mortality delivered by someone who had spent 15 years pretending neither mattered. But terrible honesty beat polished lies. The soldiers began beating their fists against their chests in rhythmic unison. The sound echoed through the courtyard like war drums. Not because they believed victory was possible, but because they recognized someone was finally telling them the truth about what they were fighting for. Not territory, not dominance, not even survival. Just the refusal to let mathematics determine human worth. The preparation for Crescent Pass consumed the next 3 days. Blackmere emptied as every soldier, every weapon, every resource got mobilized for the engagement. Kaedric moved through the preparations with mechanical efficiency, while something unfamiliar moved through his chest. Not hope. Hope was for people who believed outcomes could be controlled through positive thinking. This was different. This was acceptance that loss was likely, but resistance was still mandatory. That fighting impossible odds was the only honest response to a world that reduced people to numbers. On the evening before departure, Kaedric stood in his private chambers and looked at the man reflected in the polished steel mirror. 15 years had carved lines into his face that made him look older than his years. Gray touched his temples. Scars mapped his exposed skin like a history of violence written in scar tissue. His father's face, but different, less random in its cruelty, more intentional in its damage. The same eyes, though, cold, empty. The eyes of someone who had learned to eliminate feeling because feeling made you controllable. Except maybe those eyes were lying now. Maybe underneath the emptiness was just exhaustion from pretending not to care about anything. The thought was dangerous, potentially destabilizing. Exactly what he needed. The army marched for Crescent Pass at dawn. 3,000 soldiers moving through mountain terrain with coordinated efficiency. They traveled light, fast. Every man understood this was one-way deployment. Either they won decisively, or they didn't come back. Kaedric rode at the front beside his senior commanders. None of them spoke much. What was there to say? The mathematics were clear, the outcome probable. Words wouldn't change either. They reached the pass on the second day and began fortifying positions along the ridge line. Crescent Pass was a natural choke point where the mountains narrowed into a gap barely wide enough for an army to march through without breaking formation. Cliffs on both sides. Limited approach routes. The kind of terrain that turned numerical superiority into logistical nightmare. It wouldn't be enough, but it would be something. The scouts reported that the Royal Army was 1 day behind. 32,000 soldiers according to updated counts. Professional troops mixed with conscripts. Heavy cavalry. Siege equipment they wouldn't need because Blackmere's forces weren't defending a fortress, just defending the principle that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequence. That night, Kaedric walked through the camp while soldiers prepared weapons and wrote letters they hoped someone would deliver if they died. He didn't offer encouragement or make speeches, just moved through their ranks so they could see him, so they could understand their commander wasn't hiding in a command tent while they prepared to die. One soldier, younger than most, looked up as Kaedric passed. "Your Grace." Can I ask you something? Kadric stopped. Ask. Do you think we can win? No. The honesty seemed to surprise him. Then why are we here? Because losing while fighting is different than losing without resistance. One makes you dead, the other makes you irrelevant. The distinction seemed to satisfy him more than false optimism would have. He nodded and returned to sharpening his sword with mechanical focus. Kadric continued through the camp until he reached the edge where darkness gathered beyond the firelight. He stood looking out across the pass toward where the royal army would arrive tomorrow, with its overwhelming numbers and absolute confidence in mathematical superiority. They weren't wrong to be confident, but confidence assumed the only variable that mattered was survival. What if survival wasn't the point? What if the point was demonstrating that some people couldn't be reduced to numbers regardless of how overwhelming the mathematics became? The thought should have felt like resignation. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he had believed in years. Dawn arrived gray and cold. The royal army appeared on the horizon like a living wall of metal and flesh. Banners stretched across the pass entrance. War horns echoed off the cliffs. The sound of 30,000 soldiers preparing for battle was like thunder that didn't stop. Kadric's forces held position along the ridgeline, 3,000 against 30,000, the mathematics visible even to people who couldn't count. The royal commander sent a messenger forward under flag of truce. Young noblemen, nervous, carrying terms that were probably generous by the standards of rebellion. Surrender now, and the duke's life would be spared. His soldiers could return home. Blackmere would be absorbed into the crown, but peacefully. No executions, no reprisals. All Kadric had to do was kneel. He read the terms once, then looked at the messenger. Tell your commander I appreciate the offer. Tell him I decline. Tell him that if he wants Blackmere, he can purchase it the same way I built it, through violence and the corpses of people who thought numbers alone determined outcomes. The messenger's face went pale. Your Grace, this is suicide. Yes, but it's honest suicide. That's different than the slow version where you spend decades pretending submission is strategy. The messenger fled back down the pass. Within minutes, war horns sounded. The royal army began its advance. Kadric watched them come with the detached clarity of someone who had accepted mortality and discovered it was liberating. No more calculations about survival, no more obsessive control over variables. Just the simple recognition that this was the moment where everything either validated or collapsed, and neither outcome actually mattered beyond the next few hours. His commanders positioned forces according to the battle plan they had prepared. Archers on the ridges, infantry at the choke point, cavalry held in reserve for desperate flanking attempts that probably wouldn't work. The strategy was sound. The mathematics were still impossible. The royal army reached the pass entrance and began funneling through with coordinated efficiency. Professional soldiers who knew their business. They advanced in waves, shields raised, expecting arrow fire and defensive resistance. Kadric gave the signal. Arrows darkened the sky like locusts. The first wave of royal soldiers collapsed under the barrage. The second wave advanced over their corpses. The third wave reached the choke point where Blackmere infantry waited with weapons ready, an absolute commitment to making every foot of ground cost more lives than it was worth. The battle became chaos. Not the organized chaos of tactical maneuvers, but the raw chaos of humans trying to kill each other in confined spaces where strategy degraded into instinct and training transformed into survival reflexes. Kadric fought in the center of the line with his soldiers because commanding from safety was for people who believed their life mattered more than anyone else's. His sword found flesh with mechanical regularity. Block, strike, kill. The rhythm of violence he had learned young and perfected across 15 years of transforming moral complexity into simplified survival. But this felt different. This felt like fighting for something beyond just continuing to breathe. Every royal soldier who fell meant one less person trying to reduce human worth to numerical advantage. Every foot of ground contested meant the king's army had to pay for their assumption that overwhelming force settled all arguments. The mathematics were still losing, but the principle was winning, or at least refusing to lose quietly. Hours passed in blood and exhaustion. Kadric's forces held the choke point through sheer will and the advantages that narrow terrain provided. But advantages only delayed inevitability. The royal army was infinite. Every soldier killed got replaced by 3 more. Every defensive position collapsed eventually under pressure that never stopped. By midday, Blackmere's lines were buckling. By afternoon, they were breaking. Kedrick pulled his remaining forces back to a secondary position higher on the ridgeline, where the terrain was even more constrained. Maybe 2,000 soldiers left. Maybe less. Hard to count when exhaustion and wounds made every movement feel like drowning in mud. The Royal Army regrouped at the base of the ridge, fresh troops moving forward, the ones who had been fighting all morning withdrawn to rest. They could afford rotation because they had numbers that made attrition irrelevant. Kedrick's forces had no rotation, just diminishing bodies fighting with whatever energy remained before collapse became permanent. One of his commanders, bleeding from a dozen minor wounds, approached during the brief lull. "We can't hold another assault." "I know. Do you want to negotiate terms?" "No. Then what? We keep fighting until there's nobody left to fight. That's the only honest ending." The commander studied him for a long moment. "You've changed." "Yes." "Is it better? Ask me in an hour if I'm still alive." The final assault began before sunset. The Royal Army came up the ridge like a human avalanche, overwhelming, inevitable, the kind of force that couldn't be stopped through courage or skill or any of the things stories claimed mattered, just mathematics expressing itself through violence. Kedrick met them at the front line because dying in the rear while soldiers fought ahead was the definition of cowardice, and whatever else he had become, he wasn't that. His sword moved with exhausted precision. Every strike required effort that felt impossible. Every block drained resources that weren't replenishing. His body was failing. His will remained intact, which meant he kept fighting even as the world narrowed to the next strike, the next block, the next breath stolen between opponents who kept coming without end. Somewhere in the chaos, he took a blade across his ribs. The pain was sharp and immediate, cutting through exhaustion like lightning through fog. Blood soaked his armor. His grip on the sword weakened. He kept fighting, because stopping meant accepting that numbers determined worth, and he had spent 15 years believing that lie before Garrett's death revealed it was killing him slower than any blade could manage. Another strike caught his shoulder. The joint exploded in agony that made his arm nearly useless. He switched the sword to his left hand and continued fighting with degraded efficiency, because degraded was still movement, and movement was still resistance. A royal soldier broke through and drove steel toward Kedrick's chest. Time slowed. Not because of magic or destiny, but because extreme exhaustion and blood loss made perception strange, and reality felt disconnected from the body experiencing it. Kedrick watched the blade approach and thought about how dying here meant something different than dying in bed decades later, surrounded by empire and emptiness. This death had meaning, had purpose, had the honesty of someone who stopped pretending survival was the only thing that mattered. The blade never landed. One of Kedrick's soldiers threw himself between them, taking the strike meant for the Duke. The man collapsed with steel through his chest, dead before he hit the ground. Kedrick killed the royal soldier in retaliation, but the moment stuck with him even through continued fighting. Someone had died for him. Not because they were ordered, not because failure meant punishment, but because they chose his life over their own for reasons that had nothing to do with duty or fear. That had never happened before, never in 15 years of ruling through intimidation and systematic violence. Someone had valued him enough to die. The realization was more destabilizing than any wound. The battle continued into twilight. Blackmere's forces collapsed to maybe 500 soldiers forming a desperate circle on the ridgeline, surrounded, outnumbered, exhausted beyond anything training prepared for. The Royal Army paused its assault as darkness gathered, not because they were tired, but because killing the remaining defenders could wait until morning when visibility improved and the victory could be total. Kedrick stood in the center of the defensive circle, armor soaked with blood, sword still in hand despite wounds that should have made holding it impossible. His soldiers formed around him in protective rings because somewhere during the day they had stopped being weapons he deployed and become people he fought beside. The transformation had happened without him noticing. Or maybe he had been too busy fighting to maintain defenses that no longer mattered. One of his commanders approached with a field report that was really just a casualty list. 2,000 dead, the survivors wounded. No reinforcements, no escape routes, no options beyond surrender or death. The mathematics were finally absolute. "What are your orders?" the commander asked. Kadric looked at him for a long moment. This man had followed him through multiple campaigns, had executed orders without question, had killed on command and never asked why. Now he was asking, not for orders, but for meaning. "We fight at dawn," Kadric said quietly, "until there's nobody left or they decide killing us costs more than it's worth. That's not a strategy. That's just dying slowly." Yes, but it's dying while proving that some people can't be reduced to numbers regardless of how overwhelming the mathematics become. That matters. Does it? Ask me at dawn. The night passed in cold silence. Soldiers tended wounds that wouldn't heal fast enough to matter, wrote letters that probably wouldn't be delivered, prepared weapons for a final stand that everyone understood was just organized execution. Kadric sat apart from them, back against stone, studying the sky where stars emerged with absolute indifference to human suffering. The universe didn't care about nobility or courage or any of the concepts people use to make violence meaningful. But maybe meaning wasn't universal. Maybe it was personal. Maybe dying tomorrow mattered not because the universe cared, but because he finally did. The thought was simple, revolutionary, terrifying in its implications. Because if he could care about dying meaningfully, that meant he could care about other things too. About the soldiers surrounding him, about the people Blackmere governed, about whether power was used for survival or something more complicated, about whether becoming human again was possible, even in the middle of violence that required its absence. The question remained unanswered as dawn approached. The royal army began forming for the final assault. Kadric stood and raised his sword despite wounds that made the gesture agonizing. His soldiers formed around him one last time. And as the enemy advanced, Kadric discovered something his father had never taught him, and the world had never confirmed. That some battles were worth fighting even when losing was inevitable. That some principles mattered more than survival. That becoming human again meant accepting mortality as the price of meaning. The royal army crashed against their lines like a wave against stone. And in that moment, before chaos consumed everything, Kadric felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Not fear, not resignation, but something closer to peace. The final assault came with dawn light cutting through smoke like judgment through fog. The royal army crashed against Blackmere's collapsing circle with the mechanical efficiency of people executing a conclusion already written by mathematics. 30,000 against 500. Not a battle, an elimination. Kadric fought at the center of the chaos with movements that had degraded from technique to instinct to something closer to refusal. His body was failing in ways that made every strike feel like lifting mountains. Blood loss had turned the world gray at the edges. Pain had become so constant, it transformed into a kind of static that everything else had to compete with. He killed another royal soldier and felt nothing except the exhausted recognition that this one wouldn't be the last. They kept coming. An infinite supply of people willing to die for a king who would never remember their names, fighting to eliminate a duke who had finally learned that survival without meaning was just sophisticated decay. The mathematics were expressing themselves through violence, and the mathematics were absolute. A blade caught Kadric across the back, opening a wound that made his legs nearly buckle. He stayed upright through will alone because falling meant dying on his knees, and whatever else he had become, he wasn't that. If he was going to die today, it would be standing with sword in hand, proving that some people couldn't be reduced to numbers regardless of how overwhelming the calculations became. His remaining soldiers formed tighter around him as the defensive circle collapsed inward. Maybe 300 left, maybe less. Hard to count when the world was narrowing to the next breath, and everything beyond immediate survival had become theoretical. One of his commanders fought beside him, armor shattered, sword broken, using a captured weapon with exhausted efficiency. "We're done," the man said without emotion. "Just stating facts." "I know. Any final orders? Keep fighting until there's nobody left. That's the only honest ending." The commander nodded and returned to killing people who kept coming without end. Kadric felt something shift in his chest. Not his heart stopping, though that was probably coming soon. Something else. Some recognition that this was the moment where everything he had built for 15 years was collapsing into the dust that all empires eventually became. Blackmere would fall. His name would be remembered as a cautionary tale about ambition and rebellion. The independence he had purchased through systematic violence would evaporate like morning frost. Everything he had fought for was ending. And somehow, that felt right. Because empires built on force alone always collapsed eventually. The only variable was timing. His had lasted 15 years. Some lasted centuries, but the ending was always the same. Stone crumbling, banners burning, names forgotten by people who never cared about the violence required to carve them into history. What mattered wasn't the empire. What mattered was whether you learned to be human before the collapse consumed you. Kedrick had learned. Late. Expensively. In the middle of violence that required humanity's absence. But he had learned. That had to count for something. The royal assault intensified as commanders recognized the rebel circle was minutes from total collapse. Fresh troops poured forward with renewed energy. The kind of aggressive push that came from people who could see victory approaching and wanted to be part of the final moment. Blackmere's soldiers held through sheer refusal to die quietly. Not courage, not honor, just the stubborn unwillingness to let mathematics determine human worth without resistance. Every second they held was another second proving that some things couldn't be calculated through overwhelming force. Then something changed. The royal assault suddenly faltered, not because Blackmere forces had counterattacked, but because something was happening in the rear of the royal formation. Confusion, shouting, the sound of combat where there shouldn't be combat because the only enemies were surrounded ahead. Kedrick used the pause to catch breath that didn't come easily. His vision was narrowing, blood loss making everything feel distant and theoretical. He blinked hard to clear his sight and tried to understand what was happening. The royal army was collapsing from behind. Fresh forces were hitting their rear formations with coordinated violence. Banners he didn't recognize, soldiers who moved with professional efficiency. Not conscripts, not militia. Real soldiers executing a flanking maneuver that was turning the royal army's numerical advantage into a tactical disaster. One of his commanders pointed toward the new arrivals with exhausted confusion. Those are border house banners, the neutral lords who pledge non-interference. Why are they attacking the royal army? Because they're not neutral anymore. The realization arrived through the fog of exhaustion and blood loss. The border lords had watched Blackmere fight impossible odds and made a calculation. Not about who would win, but about what winning meant. The king had sent 30,000 soldiers to crush a duchy that demanded independence. If he succeeded here, every other territory would understand that independence meant death regardless of justification. But if Blackmere held long enough to make victory expensive, if they demonstrated that crushing rebellion required bleeding the kingdom white, then other territories might conclude that independence was worth the price. The border lords weren't rescuing Kedrick. They were protecting their own future options. Politics wrapped in violence, wrapped in self-interest. Kedrick would have laughed if breathing didn't require all available energy. The battle transformed from execution to chaos as the royal army found itself fighting on two fronts. Their numerical advantage eroded rapidly as border house forces carved through rear formations while Blackmere's survivors held the front. What had been inevitable victory minutes ago became uncertain slaughter. The royal commanders tried to adapt, but adaptation required time they didn't have. The army began fragmenting, units breaking, soldiers running, the kind of collapse that happened when overwhelming force met organized resistance it hadn't prepared for. By mid-morning, the royal army was in full retreat. By afternoon, they were scattered remnants fleeing back toward the capital with border house cavalry pursuing them through mountain passes. By evening, the pass was silent except for wind moving through corridors lined with bodies. Kedrick stood in the center of what remained, sword still in hand though his grip was weakening. Around him lay maybe 200 survivors from the 3,000 who had marched here 3 days ago. 2/3 casualties, the kind of loss that destroyed armies and broke commanders. But they had held. Not through superior tactics or divine intervention, through the simple refusal to let mathematics determine worth without resistance. One of the border lords, Duke Marcellus from the capital negotiations, approached on horseback. His armor was fresh blood but otherwise immaculate, the look of someone who had entered battle late enough to avoid the worst carnage. Duke Vesperine, Marcellus said with careful formality, You're still alive. Barely. You held longer than anyone expected. We held exactly as long as survival required. Marcellus dismounted and moved closer, studying Kaedric with the analytical attention of someone assessing structural damage. You understand why we intervened, self-interest disguised as rescue. You wanted the king to learn that crushing rebellion costs more than tolerating autonomy. Exactly. Marcellus smiled slightly. You've become expensive to eliminate. That makes you valuable to preserve. Strange mathematics, the only mathematics that matters. Marcellus gestured toward the pass filled with bodies. This changes the political landscape. The king can't send another army. The treasury is exhausted. The nobility is fractured. You've accidentally created conditions for broader independence movements. Not accidentally. Kaedric leaned against his sword for support because standing without it was becoming theoretical. I created conditions for people to recognize that power without consent eventually drowns in its own blood. Poetic. Marcellus studied him carefully. What happens now? Now I go home and discover whether Blackmere still exists, or if my absence let it collapse into something unrecognizable. The return journey took 6 days because wounded soldiers moved slowly, and Kaedric's injuries required constant medical attention that barely kept him functional. His body was failing in cascading ways that made every mile feel impossible. Infection had set into the rib wound. His shoulder was useless. Blood loss had left him weak enough that mounting a horse required assistance. But he stayed conscious through sheer will, because unconsciousness meant losing control. And control was the only thing that had kept him alive for 15 years. Even if control was probably an illusion maintained through obsessive attention to variables that ultimately didn't matter. The border lords who had intervened traveled with them for 2 days before splitting off toward their own territories. Marcellus stayed longest, riding beside Kaedric's litter while they moved through mountain passes. You know this isn't over, Marcellus said on the final evening before departure. The king won't accept what happened here. He'll find other ways to undermine Blackmere. Let him try. I've stopped caring about maintaining empire through systematic intimidation. That's exhausting, and it doesn't work. What will you do instead? Figure out what governance looks like when it's not just organized violence wrapped in ceremony. That's ambitious. That's necessary. The alternative is becoming what my father was, powerful and empty and dead inside long before the body stops moving. Marcellus considered this. You've changed. The Duke who went to the capital 6 months ago would never have said something like that. The Duke who went to the capital 6 months ago was a corpse pretending to be alive. I'm trying something different now. Is it working? Ask me in a year if I survive that long. They reached Blackmere on the 7th day. The fortress stood above the cliffs exactly as Kaedric had left it. Black stone, iron banners, the architecture of dominance that had defined his rule for 15 years. But something about it felt different now. Less like home and more like monument to a version of himself he was learning to leave behind. The gates opened as they approached. Servants and remaining guards lined the courtyard in organized rows. Not because protocol demanded it, but because they genuinely seemed relieved their duke had returned alive. That had never happened before. Never in 15 years of ruling through fear and systematic violence had anyone seemed happy to see him, rather than just terrified of disobeying. The transformation was more destabilizing than any wound. Kaedric dismounted with assistants and stood in the courtyard while his surviving soldiers filtered through the gates. 200 men who had held impossible ground and discovered that resistance mattered more than victory. They moved with the exhausted pride of people who had learned something about themselves that couldn't be taught through training. One soldier, the young one who had asked about winning, approached with careful formality. Your Grace, permission to speak? Granted. Did it matter? What we did? Kaedric studied him for a long moment. The question deserved honesty. Yes. Not because we won, but because we proved that some people refuse to be reduced to numbers regardless of how overwhelming the mathematics become. That matters. Even if most of us died, especially then. Easy refusal is just posturing. Expensive refusal is principle. The soldier nodded slowly, processing this. Thank you. For what? For not lying about it. After the soldiers dispersed, Kaedric climbed the spiral stairs to his private chambers in the highest tower. The journey required frequent stops because his body was failing in ways that rest wouldn't fix. Infection, blood loss, exhaustion that went beyond physical into something closer to spiritual. He was dying. Not immediately, but inevitably. The wounds were too severe, the damage too extensive. Medical attention had kept him functional long enough to return home, but functional was temporary. Days. Maybe weeks if he was unlucky. The realization arrived with surprising calm. Death was just another calculation. Inevitable. Predictable. The only variable was whether you faced it with meaning or just biological termination. Kaedric had meaning now. That would have to be enough. His chambers were exactly as he had left them. Sparse. Organized. The space of someone who viewed comfort as weakness and decoration as waste. He studied the room with new perspective and recognized it for what it was. A prison built from the inside. A monument to control that had become its own form of captivity. He had spent 15 years building these walls. Now they just felt empty. The days that followed passed in strange suspension. Kaedric's wounds slowly improved under medical care that bordered on obsessive. His soldiers recovered in the barracks while servants returned the fortress to functional operation. Trade resumed. Reports arrived about border territories. The rhythms of governance continued with mechanical efficiency. But everything felt different now. The nobles who sent tribute did so with less fear and more calculation. The servants moved through halls with less terror and more purpose. The soldiers trained with dedication that came from respect rather than intimidation. Blackmere was transforming from fortress into something closer to community. The change was gradual, incremental, the kind of shift that happened slowly across months until one day you noticed the entire structure had reorganized itself while you weren't watching. Kaedric spent most of his time in the Eastern Conservatory that had been abandoned for years before being restored. The space had glass ceilings that let in light without exposing inhabitants to weather. Gardens grew in organized chaos. Stone benches provided places to sit while recovering from wounds that were healing slower than they should. He went there because silence lived in that space. Not the threatening silence of power, but the peaceful silence of places where nothing demanded immediate response. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the return, Kaedric sat in the conservatory while rain drummed against the glass ceiling. His wounds had healed enough to make movement possible without assistance. The infection had cleared. His strength was returning gradually, though he would never move with the same fluid violence that had characterized 15 years of combat. That was fine. He had stopped needing to be dangerous every moment. Footsteps approached from behind, soft, measured, familiar even though he hadn't heard them in months. "Your Grace." Kaedric turned to find Lady Meredith Ashford standing in the doorway, the hostage he had released before the campaign against Garrett. She wore traveling clothes and looked exhausted in ways that suggested long journey rather than injury. "Lady Meredith, I wasn't expecting you. I heard what happened at Crescent Pass." She moved closer, studying him with analytical attention. "I wanted to see if the stories were true." "Which stories?" "That you held impossible ground, that you transformed from tyrant into something resembling human, that Blackmere is different now. All true, more or less." She sat on the bench across from him without asking permission. That level of informality would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. Now it just seemed appropriate for whatever their relationship had become. "My father sent me to assess the situation," Meredith said carefully. "He wants to know if Blackmere is stable or if the independence movement is collapsing. Tell him Blackmere is more stable than it's ever been, just different than he expects." "Different how?" "Different in that I've stopped ruling through systematic intimidation and started trying to figure out what governance looks like when it's not just organized violence. That's ambitious. That's necessary." Kaedric gestured at the conservatory. "This fortress was built to project power. Now I'm trying to figure out if it can be something other than a monument to dominance. Can it? I don't know. But trying seems more honest than continuing to pretend force alone creates sustainable authority." Meredith studied him for a long moment. "You really have changed. The Duke who held me hostage would never have admitted uncertainty about anything. The Duke who held you hostage was a corpse pretending to be alive. I'm trying something different now. Is it working?" Some days. Other days, I remember that 15 years of learned brutality doesn't evaporate just because you decide to be human again. The honesty seemed to surprise her. What changed? I killed my only friend because he betrayed me for good reasons. Then I nearly died, proving that some principles matter more than survival. Somewhere in that process, I discovered that power without meaning is just sophisticated emptiness. That's a hard lesson. All the important ones are. They sat in silence while rain continued against the glass ceiling. The sound was soothing in ways that violence never achieved. Kadrick thought about how much had changed in 6 months. The campaign, the betrayal, the battle. The transformation from tyrant into something resembling human. The journey had been expensive, measured in bodies and broken principles, and the slow recognition that everything he had built for 15 years was ultimately hollow. But expensive didn't mean wrong. Sometimes the most important transformations required destroying everything you thought made you strong to discover what actually mattered underneath the armor. "What will you do now?" Meredith asked finally. "Govern. Differently than before. See if Blackmere can become something other than fortress built on fear. And if it can't, then at least I died trying instead of dying slowly inside walls I built to keep myself imprisoned. That's not much of a plan." "No, but it's honest. That's different than what I've been doing for 15 years. Meredith stood slowly. "I should return to my father. He'll want a full report. Tell him Blackmere is open for genuine alliance rather than coerced submission. Tell him the Duke has learned that power without consent is just organized violence waiting to collapse. Tell him the Northern Territories are available for trade partnerships that benefit both parties rather than extraction disguised as taxation." She smiled slightly. "That's a very different message than he expected." "Good. Different is what I'm attempting." After she left, Kadrick remained in the conservatory until evening. He thought about the empire he had built and the transformation that was slowly dismantling it into something less impressive but more sustainable. Power was easy. Fear was simple. Control was just obsessive attention to variables that ultimately didn't matter. What was hard was learning to be human again after spending 15 years eliminating everything vulnerable. That was the real work. Not conquering territories or defeating armies or maintaining dominance through systematic intimidation, but reconstructing humanity from pieces that had been carefully destroyed because vulnerability felt like suicide in a world that reduced people to numbers. The months that followed passed in slow transformation. Blackmere gradually shifted from fortress to something resembling functional community. Kadrick released the remaining noble hostages with genuine offers of partnership rather than coerced submission. Trade agreements were renegotiated on terms that benefited both parties. Tax structures reformed to reduce extraction and increase investment in territories rather than just bleeding them for resources. The changes were gradual, incremental, the kind of systemic reform that happened slowly until one day you noticed the entire structure had reorganized itself while you weren't watching. Not all nobles accepted the transformation. Some still expected the tyrant duke who ruled through fear. Those ones discovered that Kadrick was willing to enforce boundaries with violence when necessary, but preferred negotiation when possible. The distinction mattered. It meant power became tool rather than identity, something deployed strategically rather than maintained obsessively. The difference was subtle but absolute. One evening, 6 months after Crescent Pass, Kadrick stood in the war room studying maps that had been redrawn to reflect new political arrangements. Blackmere remained independent but cooperated with border territories through genuine alliance rather than coerced submission. Trade flourished. Military tensions decreased. The kingdom was learning that autonomy could coexist with stability if both parties approached the arrangement honestly. Garrett would have been proud. The thought arrived without the pain that used to accompany memories of betrayal. Garrett had died trying to stop someone he believed had become monstrous. He had been right. The Duke Kadrick had been 6 months ago was monstrous. Powerful but hollow. Effective but empty. What remained now was different. Less impressive maybe. More human definitely. Footsteps approached from behind. Kadrick turned to find one of his senior advisors, a man who had served Blackmere for decades and witnessed every transformation. "Your Grace, the Eastern Trade Delegation has arrived. They're requesting audience. Show them to the receiving hall. I'll be there shortly." The advisor hesitated. If I may speak freely? Always. You've changed this place. Not just the politics, but the atmosphere. People walk these halls differently now. Better or worse? Different. The advisor considered carefully. Less afraid, more purposeful. I think it's better, but I'm old enough to remember when fear kept things simple. Fear keeps things simple until it destroys everything worth maintaining. Kadrick moved toward the door. I prefer complicated and sustainable over simple and collapsing. Wise. Though wisdom is easier after nearly dying. Most lessons are. That night, Kadrick stood at the window of his private chambers looking out across Blackmere while moonlight turned the fortress silver. The empire he had built was transforming into something less impressive but more honest. Power was becoming partnership. Control was becoming cooperation. The systematic violence that had characterized 15 years was giving way to something closer to genuine governance. The transformation was incomplete. Maybe it would always be incomplete. But incomplete progress beat perfect stagnation. He thought about his father, about the lessons delivered through brutality, about how those lessons had shaped him into something powerful and hollow, about how Garrett's betrayal had cracked that hollow shell enough to let something human back inside. The journey had been expensive, measured in bodies and broken principles and the slow recognition that strength wasn't eliminating vulnerability but surviving with it intact. His father had been wrong about everything that mattered. Sentiment wasn't weakness. Connection wasn't liability. Humanity wasn't something to eliminate, but something to protect even when protection required vulnerability. The realization had arrived late, expensively, in the middle of violence that nearly killed him. But it had arrived. That had to count for something. Kadrick turned from the window and studied his reflection in the polished steel mirror. 15 years had carved lines into his face that made him look older than his years. Scars mapped his skin like history written in tissue damage. Gray touched his temples where exhaustion had accelerated aging. His father's face, but different, softer somehow despite the scars. More human despite the damage. The eyes were different too, less empty, more present. The eyes of someone who had learned to feel again after 15 years of systematic elimination. The transformation wasn't complete. Maybe it would never be complete. But transformation didn't require completion. It just required commitment to becoming something other than what fear and trauma had constructed. Outside, Blackmere settled into its nighttime rhythms. Guards patrolled walls with professional attention rather than terrified obedience. Servants completed their work with purpose rather than fear. The fortress breathed like a living thing rather than monument to dominance. The empire was transforming, slowly, painfully, honestly, into something less impressive but more sustainable than what violence alone could maintain. And Kadrick Vesperine, Duke of Blackmere, who had spent 15 years becoming what survival demanded, was learning that survival without meaning was just sophisticated emptiness, and meaning required the vulnerability he had spent decades eliminating. The journey was incomplete, the destination uncertain, but the direction was finally honest. And honesty, he was discovering, mattered more than power ever had. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the fortress walls, the future waited with all its terrible possibilities. More challenges, more betrayals. The endless work of maintaining something sustainable rather than just powerful. But sustainable beat impressive. Honest beat effective. Human beat perfect. And Kadrick was finally learning to be human again. Late. Expensively. In the ruins of empire built on force alone. But learning nonetheless. That would have to be enough. Because enough was all anyone ever got. And learning to accept enough was the final lesson his father never taught and the world never confirmed. Until Garrett's death revealed it was the only lesson that actually mattered. The fortress fell silent around him. The empire transformed quietly. And in that silence and transformation, something resembling peace finally became possible for the Duke, who had spent 15 years believing peace was just another word for weakness. He had been wrong about everything that mattered, but wrong could be corrected. Late. Expensively. Honestly. An honest correction was the only form of redemption available to people who had spent years becoming what fear demanded. Kadrick accepted it. Not because he deserved it, but because continuing to be what he had been was just prolonged suicide wearing power as disguise. And he had finally learned that survival without humanity was no survival at all, just sophisticated decay. Wearing a crown. The rain began again before dawn, drumming against the black stone towers of Blackmere like the rhythmic promise that some things endured regardless of who claimed to rule them. The fortress stood. The empire transformed. The Duke who had built everything on fear was learning that rebuilding on something else required courage of a different kind entirely. The kind that accepted vulnerability as strength rather than weakness. The kind that chose meaning over dominance. The kind that his father would have called suicide and Garrett would have called human. Kedrick called it necessary. And necessary was the only justification that ever really mattered.